North Sydney Council's application to the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, which is run by the New South Wales Government, is undergoing a consultation period right now. But the deadline for that consultation period is very, very close. In fact, close of business, Monday, 24 of March. Now, North Sydney Sun has been talking to a lot of residents who are concerned about this rate rise, and we've, I guess, collected a bit of a sample of some of the arguments being mounted against this rate rise. This video is going to take a look at some of them. The first major theme that we've seen in the submissions is the claim that this 87% rate rise will lead to what is basically an excess revenue collection for council, way and above their actual needs. So the general consensus is that the SRV, the special rate variation, will generate an extra $550 million over the next 10 years. That brings the total ratepayer contribution to $1.3 billion over that period. Now, the common perception, which I pick up talking to a lot of people, is that they believe this SRV has been prompted by the overruns on North Sydney Olympic Pool. But the reality is that the pool at best needs $100 million, but more precisely probably around $55 million. That's just 10% of the $550 million that this SRV will raise, which begs the question, what is the other money needed for? Well, a big proportion of the remaining 450 to 500 million or so will go to a so-called $146 million infrastructure backlog. But that's been called into question because that large number has been prompted by an accounting redefinition of assets that need work. Prior to this, you budgeted for assets that were in a poor condition, but a revised approach adding so-called category 4 assets. They effectively are assets that remain functional but are just nearing a technical time period for renewal, regardless of any assessment of their actual condition. One could question whether there is actually a genuine need for these extra funds. Another contradiction that's been picked up by submitters to the process is North Sydney Council's claim that it's in an unsustainable financial position. But according to its December 2024 quarterly budget review, it recorded a $13.1 million operating surplus, significantly higher than a $1.6 million surplus that was originally anticipated. The report also showed that the council's cash and investment holdings stood at $141 million, just $3 million lower than the previous year, despite the perception that the North Sydney pool overruns were causing a big raid on cash reserves. Indeed, the cash reserve issue is a really interesting one because if the 87% rate increase proceeds, the primary outcome appears to be a rise to nearly $290 million in cash reserves over the decade. The council has not actually, to my mind, and definitely to many of the submitters' minds, justified why it needs to hold $4,000 in cash and investments per each resident of the 72,000 residents in the LGA, particularly at a time when there are challenging global economic conditions and rising living costs. Now, the third issue that many submissions have raised is that around what is perceived to be a concealment of these claims financial issues, and particularly around the appointment of a consultancy called Morrison Lowe, which advised council on how to develop its strategy for getting this special rate variation approved. This has been articulated most clearly by a former councillor, Ian Mutton, who had been a councillor for the prior 2 terms but was not elected this term. He says that it was only weeks after the election that councillors were presented with a financial report declaring financial difficulties, and he questions why this was not disclosed before the election, because voters might have made different choices at the ballot box had they been aware. So Morrison Lowe was actually engaged or approved by council to develop this strategy just 5 days after the election when votes were still being counted. And a Freedom of Information search that's been conducted and reported exclusively by the North Sydney Sun shows that Council and Morrison Lowe were in contact with each other about this proposal on the date of August 5, which was 40 days before the election. So if Council had these financial issues that necessitated an SRV 40 days before the election, how come no one knew about it? The fourth major criticism that we're picking up in the submissions is that of selective practices around the consultation with ratepayers between late November and over December through to early January. So, for example, there was an online public survey. To actually complete the survey, you had to agree to a rate rise of 65%, 75%, 87%, or over 100%. There were no other options or lower options or even a no option. The survey results are thus skewed. And even then, only 4% of those respondents who made it to the end of the survey actually voted for the 87% rate rise that Council has embarked upon. There was a separate survey that asked for written comments, and a North Sydney Sun analysis of those comments suggests that only 1% of them overtly supported the rate rise as proposed. The vast majority of them, in the high 90s, were directly opposed to a rate rise, which perhaps might be a more accurate measure of how ratepayers feel about this. There's also a general question of what happened at the actual council meeting itself. There were 44 registered speakers to speak about the rate rise. Now, many of them were turned away because there wasn't room in the council chambers to accommodate them. But in the end, about 25 people spoke against the proposal. Only 2 or 3 people spoke for it. What's really interesting is that that meeting concluded at 8 minutes past 11. And within that next hour, Council submitted its IPART submission, which meant that it took no allowance of anything that was discussed at the meeting. The submission had already been written, locked and loaded to be sent the minute the council meeting had ended. So there was absolutely no purpose to that public meeting or to any of those people who turned up and gave their contributions. As I say, were mostly negative about the SRV because their feedback simply wasn't incorporated into the submission. Now, the final theme that we've been picking up very strongly in submissions is a sentiment that council doesn't deserve to get this 87% rate variation through because it hasn't earned the social license to do so. This is on the basis of various opportunities or projects that it's perceived to have failed at or not done well at. So an obvious one is North Sydney Pool, originally budgeted at around $63 million. The cost has blown out from under $100 million to now $102 million. We really don't know why that has happened. A second project that we've seen cited is that of the new parking meters earlier in 2024. It was widely perceived to have been a failure in its execution, very, very difficult to use, and actually in some respects designed to reduce revenue as a feature of the system. Some people feel this is quite incongruous in light of council basically saying we need a rate rise because parking fees are reducing. Well, council designed a system that appeared almost destined for those revenues to reduce should ratepayers have to compensate for that. Another issue that has been raised, and this was actually raised at the council meeting on the 10th of February, which approved the SRV, and that's about a contract awarded to JC Dassault in 2022 to install digital advertising panels throughout the LGA, which is a revenue earner for council. Now, according to a representative of that company who turned up and spoke at that meeting, only 6 of the 54 planned installations have been deployed, and he estimated that this lack of execution could cost the council some $20 million in lost revenue over the remaining duration of the contract. Again, people are asking the question, you leave revenue such as that on the shelf because of your own slow approval processes. Again, why should ratepayers have to make up the slack? So these are the themes that we're picking up in terms of submissions. Many ratepayers have been in contact with North Sydney Sun by email to ask us questions or to share their thoughts. I have never seen this type of reaction to a council issue, and I've lived in this LGA for way over a quarter of a century in total. Hopefully this is of assistance to our viewers in understanding the issues. And if you want to get your view across, as I say, go to the IPART website. There's an online survey there, a submission button. Get your views to them at 5 p.m. on Monday.